Imagine being dragged through the streets in handcuffs, treated like a criminal, while the entire village watches in silence. Imagine the humiliation of being accused of theft, when in reality, you own everything around you. Every field, every house, every path. This is not a tale from fiction, but the shocking story of a poor farmer, mocked and beaten by police officers, until the truth revealed he was the silent landowner of an entire village. Comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun always rose gently over the fields, painting the sky in soft strokes of orange and pink. But for Abdul Rahman, the beauty of dawn had long been overshadowed by the weight of survival. To the villagers, he was just the poor farmer, a man in faded clothes, worn-out sandals, and a face marked with lines of hardship. He worked from the first light of morning until darkness swallowed the horizon, bending his back in the soil that had been his companion since childhood. Few ever paused to notice the quiet dignity in his eyes, the silence in which he carried secrets far heavier than the sacks of grain he hauled each season. Life in the village was cruel to men like him. The richer families flaunted their motorcycles, their smartphones, their flashy weddings. They often mocked Abdul Rahman when they saw him leading his 2 oxen across the fields, pulling an old wooden plow that looked like it belonged in another century. Children laughed when his turban slipped out of place, and shopkeepers would delay giving him change, muttering as though his coins carried less worth. Yet, he never argued, never raised his voice. Instead, he carried himself with patience, a kind of patience that wasn't born of weakness, but of something deeper. Abdul Rahman had grown up in this very village, in a small mud house on the edge of the fields. His father had been a respected man once, known not for his wealth, but for his honor. But time had stolen everything. Bad harvests, debts, and family disputes had stripped away their dignity, leaving only whispers of who they once were. By the time Abdul Rahman was old enough to understand the world, he had already been branded as poor, as though poverty were not just his condition, but his very identity. He accepted it outwardly, but deep within, he carried a fire, a promise to himself that one day, truth would come to light. There was one thing nobody in the village knew. Hidden inside an old wooden trunk in Abdul Rahman's modest home were stacks of papers, deeds, and maps. His late father had passed them on with trembling hands, whispering words Abdul Rahman never forgot. Never boast about what you own, son. Let the land speak when the time is right. Those papers prove that the land stretching across the entire village, from the northern orchards to the southern riverbanks, belonged to Abdul Rahman's family. Over 300 acres of fertile soil, silently his. Yet, he never revealed it. Instead, he chose to live like an ordinary farmer, working side by side with the laborers, watching as others built houses and businesses on his land without realizing whose name was written on the title. Why would man hide such wealth? The answer lay in his father's wisdom. Years ago, when greedy relatives and corrupt officials had tried to seize their land, Abdul Rahman's father had disguised their fortune under layers of humility. They lived like the poor, so they would not be robbed by the powerful. Abdul Rahman inherited not just the land, but the strategy to wait, to be patient, and to never let arrogance poison his soul. But patience came with a cost. Every insult he endured, every humiliation he swallowed, weighed heavily on him. Still, he bore it with the calm of a man who knew time would eventually turn. The villagers often saw Abdul Rahman in the market, standing quietly with a bundle of vegetables. While others haggled, he would simply accept whatever price was offered, smiling faintly even when he was cheated. This man has no courage, the shopkeepers would laugh. But Abdul Rahman's silence was not cowardice, it was restraint. He had learned to observe people closely, to measure their hearts not by their words, but by their actions. And he knew one day, those who mocked him would stand ashamed before him. His wife, Amina, was the only one who knew the truth. A gentle woman with tired eyes, but a strong spirit, she often worried about the life they portrayed. People treat you like dirt, she would whisper at night. Why do you let them? Why not tell them who you really are? Abdul Rahman would shake his head, pulling the thin blanket over them both. Not yet, he would reply softly. The fruit ripens when Allah wills, not when we desire. Our silence is our shield. Their children grew up under the same cloak of poverty. They wore second-hand uniforms to school, their shoes patched with cloth, their books borrowed from neighbors. Other kids mocked them, calling them beggars, but Abdul Rahman taught his children to respond with dignity. Knowledge is your wealth, he told them. The world may laugh at you now, but one day they will bow their heads. His words, though gentle, carried the weight of unshakable belief. The seasons turned. Crops rose and fell. Abdul Rahman labored endlessly, his hands calloused, his back bent, his skin darkened by the sun. Yet, beneath the surface of this ordinary man was an extraordinary truth waiting to surface. A truth that would shake not only the villagers, but the very foundation of those who believed wealth defined worth. But destiny does not reveal its treasures without first testing the soul. Abdul Rahman's test came on an afternoon that began like any other. The sky was cloudless, the air thick with the smell of freshly plowed earth. He had just returned from the fields, sweat dripping down his face, when the sound of motorcycles roared down the dusty path. A group of policemen, their uniforms stiff and their eyes cold, stormed into the village. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about theft, livestock disappearing, crops vanishing, even a few burglaries in the nearby town. And when the police came searching for a culprit, the villagers, eager to protect themselves, pointed fingers at the easiest target. The poor farmer who had no voice, no power, no defenders. They say he's the thief, one villager whispered. He looks hungry all the time. Maybe he stole to feed his family, another added. Who else could it be? He's always wandering at night with his lantern, a third chimed in. And just like that, suspicion turned into accusation, accusation into action. The police marched straight to Abdul Rahman's door. The knock on Abdul Rahman's door wasn't a knock at all. It was a violent thud, the kind that makes even the walls shudder. Amina rushed out of the kitchen, her hands trembling as the children clung to her legs. Abdul Rahman, still wiping sweat from his brow, opened the door slowly, only to find 3 policemen standing there, their eyes sharp with suspicion. You're coming with us, one officer barked, without explanation. Abdul Rahman's brows furrowed. Coming with you? For what reason, Sahib? For theft. The officer spat the word like poison. We've had complaints. Livestock, tools, even jewelry stolen from nearby houses. Witnesses saw you wandering around at night. Don't act innocent. A crowd had already begun to gather outside. Villagers peeked from their courtyards, whispering excitedly as though the festival had arrived early. Some smirked, others shook their heads, but no one stepped forward to defend a man they had known their whole lives. After all, what loyalty was owed to a poor farmer? Amina tried to speak, her voice breaking. My husband has never stolen anything in his life. He was in the fields yesterday until sunset. You can ask anyone. But the officers weren't listening. One of them grabbed Abdul Rahman's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. The children began to cry, tugging at their father's shirt, their small voices drowned out by the metallic snap of handcuffs. The villagers leaned closer, eager to watch the spectacle. See, I told you. A man in the crowd whispered. He always looks suspicious. He walks with his head down, like he's hiding something, another said. Their words cut deeper than any chain. Abdul Rahman, a man who had carried burdens in silence all his life, now carried the greatest humiliation of all, to be paraded like a criminal in front of those who mocked him. He could have spoken. He could have shouted the truth, revealed the papers that proved he owned more land than the entire village combined. But he didn't. His father's words echoed in his mind. Patience, son. The fruit ripens when Allah wills. The police dragged him through the dusty street. Children laughed, chasing behind, mimicking his limp walk. Shopkeepers leaned against their doors, whispering as though confirming a rumor long suspected. Abdul Rahman's dignity was being stripped with every step, yet his silence remained unbroken. At the station, the interrogation began. The room smelled of sweat and stale tea, the ceiling fan creaking above. Abdul Rahman was pushed onto a wooden bench, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. The officer in charge, a stout man with a thick mustache, circled him like a predator. "Where did you hide the stolen goods?" he demanded. "I have stolen nothing," Abdul Rahman replied calmly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. A slap cracked across his face, echoing against the walls. Blood welled at the corner of his lip. "Don't play games with me," the officer roared. "You think we don't know? Poor men like you, always jealous of those with wealth. You steal because you have nothing." The irony burned in Abdul Rahman's chest. Nothing? If only they knew. If only they could see the papers hidden in his trunk, the legacy of generations resting quietly under his roof. But he would not betray that secret, not under force, not under shame. Hour after hour, the questioning continued. They accused him of stealing goats, of breaking into houses, of plotting with bandits. Each time, his answer was the same. Calm denial, rooted not in fear, but in the knowledge that truth cannot be erased by lies. Still, his silence only enraged them more. They beat him, shoved him, threatened him with jail time. Back in the village, the news spread like wildfire. Women gossiped at the well, men muttered in tea stalls. Some expressed pity, but most felt vindicated. "We always knew he wasn't right," they said. "No man works that hard without hiding something." His children faced the cruelest of taunts at school, mocked for having a thief as a father. Amina, alone in her small house, wept silently, clutching the bundle of deeds in her lap. She wanted to scream the truth, to storm into the station and throw the papers at their feet, but she remembered her husband's words. Patience. Days blurred into nights. Abdul Rahman was kept in a dim cell, the cold floor his bed, the dripping ceiling his lullaby. His body ached from beatings, but his spirit remained unbroken. He prayed in the darkness, whispering verses that gave him strength. He thought of his children's faces, of Amina's tearful eyes, and he vowed to endure. For he knew, patience was not just waiting. It was faith that justice would arrive, even if delayed. Then came the turning point. A small-time thief was caught in a neighboring town with stolen jewelry in his pocket. Under pressure, the thief confessed, not only to the burglary, but to framing Abdul Rahman. He admitted the villagers had pointed to the poor farmer to save themselves from suspicion. The police were stunned, embarrassed by their haste, their cruelty. But admitting their mistake was not simple. For days, they debated what to do, fearing the shame of freeing a man they had humiliated so publicly. And while they hesitated, a letter arrived. A lawyer from the city had heard of the case, a young man with fiery ideals and a sharp tongue. He had once been a student in Abdul Rahman's village, a boy who had often been given free vegetables from Abdul Rahman's fields when his own family was too poor to buy food. The lawyer remembered the farmer's kindness and could not bear the injustice. He came, determined to fight not just for Abdul Rahman's freedom, but for his honor. When the lawyer entered the station, his voice thundered louder than the officers. "You accuse a man without evidence, beat him without proof, and humiliate him before his children. And for what? To satisfy your pride? To cover your incompetence?" His words cut through the air like knives. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their confidence faltering. They had expected silence from Abdul Rahman, but now a storm was brewing, a storm that would reveal truths they were never prepared to face. The station walls had never echoed with such words before. The lawyer, his eyes burning with conviction, stood tall in front of the officers who had once towered over Abdul Rahman. He was young, barely in his 30s, but his presence filled the room with a gravity that could not be ignored. Papers rustled in his hand as he slammed them onto the desk, his voice unwavering. "You have no evidence, no witnesses, no stolen property found on him. Yet you kept him locked up, beaten, humiliated, and paraded through his own village as a criminal. Tell me, officers, what law allows you this cruelty?" The head officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His mustache twitched as he tried to form an answer, but none came. His eyes darted to the constables beside him, as though seeking rescue. But the lawyer wasn't done. You think because he is poor, because he wears torn clothes and eats stale bread, he cannot fight back? Let me remind you, justice is not the property of the rich. And this man you scorn? You don't even know who he is. A ripple of confusion ran through the room. The officers frowned. The constables exchanged glances. Even Abdul Rahman, sitting quietly with his swollen wrists and bruised face, raised his head slightly at the lawyer's words. The lawyer looked at him, nodding, silently telling him, "It's time." The next day, the case was taken to the district court. The villagers gathered outside, curious and hungry for drama. Some came to laugh, others to gossip, but none expected the storm that was about to unfold. Abdul Rahman was brought in, still in his plain clothes, his dignity buried under the scars of police brutality. Yet beside him stood the lawyer, armed not just with law, but with memory of kindness repaid in the form of unwavering defense. The courtroom smelled of ink and old wood, the ceiling fans groaning overhead. The judge, a stern man with silver hair, sat in his chair, tapping his pen impatiently. "Proceed," he ordered. The prosecution was weak. Their only claim rested on hearsay and the villagers' suspicion. "He is poor," they argued. "He was seen wandering at night. Who else could be responsible?" The lawyer rose. His voice carried weight, every word sharpened by truth. "Your Honor, if poverty is a crime, then half this nation would be behind bars. If walking at night is evidence, then every watchman and farmer should be shackled. But let us speak not in guesses, but in facts." He turned, his eyes sweeping the courtroom. "This man you call a thief. Do you know how many mouths he has fed from his fields? How many times he has given away grain without asking for a single rupee? Do you know how often he has endured insult in silence, only to extend kindness in return?" The villagers lowered their eyes. Whispers rippled through the room. Some shifted uncomfortably, recalling the times Abdul Rahman had helped them quietly, refusing payment. The weight of memory pressed against their conscience. The lawyer continued, his voice rising. "And if that is not enough, let me show you something." He lifted a bundle of papers from his briefcase, carefully tied with string. He laid them before the judge. "These are official deeds, maps, and titles. Stamped, notarized, and legal. They prove ownership of every acre of land in that village. And whose name rests on them? Abdul Rahman." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The villagers craned their necks, disbelief etched across their faces. The officers shifted in panic, their arrogance crumbling. Abdul Rahman sat still, his eyes lowered, as though the revelation were heavier than the humiliation he had endured. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He examined the documents, flipping page after page. His eyes widened as the truth sank in. He looked directly at Abdul Rahman, studying the quiet man before him. "Is this true?" he asked softly. Abdul Rahman finally raised his eyes. His voice was calm, steady, yet it carried the weight of decades. "Yes, Your Honor. This land has been in my family for generations. My father entrusted me with it, along with his words. Never flaunt what you own, for arrogance destroys men faster than poverty. I chose silence. I chose patience. And so I lived as the poorest man, though I owned the soil beneath every footstep in that village." The courtroom erupted. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into exclamations. Some villagers wept in shame. Others hung their heads, unable to meet his gaze. The officers' faces drained of color, their authority shattered. For in humiliating him, they had humiliated the true master of the land on which they themselves stood. The lawyer's voice thundered once more. "You called him a thief. You chained him, beat him, disgraced him. But he never lifted a hand in anger, never revealed his truth to crush you. Today, Your Honor, I demand not just his release, but justice. Justice for the man you turned into a spectacle. Justice for the dignity stolen from him." The judge struck his gavel. The sound cracked like lightning. "Enough. This man is innocent. More than that, he is a victim of false accusation, of police cruelty, and of the villagers' prejudice. He is free, effective immediately, and this court will not overlook the misconduct shown by the authorities." The words fell heavy, final, undeniable. Abdul Rahman stood slowly. The chains were removed. His wrists, bruised and scarred, bore silent witness to what he had endured. Yet as he walked out of the courtroom, he did not lift his chin in pride. He walked with the same humility that had carried him through life. And that humility burned brighter than any wealth could ever boast. Outside, the crowd waited. The villagers could not meet his eyes. Some stepped back, ashamed. Others muttered apologies under their breath. But Abdul Rahman said nothing. He looked at the sky, whispered a prayer of gratitude, and walked home with his wife and children. But this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a storm that would shake the village to its core. The silence in the village that night was heavier than any storm. The same mouths that had once mocked Abdul Rahman now whispered his name in trembling tones. The man they had ridiculed for years as the poor farmer had turned out to be the silent master of the soil beneath their very feet. At the tea stall, where laughter and gossip usually rang late into the night, the benches were crowded with uneasy men. Some stared into their cups, too ashamed to speak. Others muttered defensively. "How are we to know?" One man said, his voice sharp with guilt disguised as anger. "He never told anyone. He dressed like a beggar. How could we respect him?" Another argued. But beneath their excuses was a truth none of them could deny. They had judged him by his clothes, not his character. Meanwhile, the police station was in chaos. The head officer, once arrogant and loud, now sat pale in his office, chain-smoking nervously. Reports of the court session had already reached his superiors. He feared suspension, perhaps even worse. His constables whispered in corners, blaming each other for the brutality inflicted on Abdul Rahman. The shame of striking an innocent man, one who owned more land than their own station house stood upon, weighed heavy. But while guilt consumed others, Abdul Rahman sat quietly in his home. The wooden trunk lay open before him, the deeds and maps spread out like silent witnesses to the truth. Amina folded them carefully, her fingers trembling as though touching something sacred. "It's out now," she whispered. "The whole world knows. You don't have to hide anymore." Abdul Rahman shook his head. "We still have to live here. Truth is powerful, yes, but can also breed envy. What matters is not that they know I own this land. What matters is how we live after they know." His children listened in silence, their young eyes wide with both pride and fear. The taunts they had endured at school had stopped overnight. Where once their classmates mocked their patched clothes, now they were treated with awkward respect. But the children had inherited their father's humility. They did not boast. They walked home quietly, heads bowed, even when others whispered. Those are the landowner's children. Days turned into weeks, and the shift in the village grew sharper. Families who had built houses on Abdul Rahman's land began to panic. Shopkeepers who had cheated him in the market now bowed nervously when he passed. Even the wealthiest families, who had once looked down on him, now sent emissaries with gifts, hoping to repair old wounds. But Abdul Rahman never changed. He still rose at dawn, still plowed the fields with his oxen, still bought vegetables with exact change at the market. The only difference was the silence that followed him. Where once there had been laughter at his expense, now there was shameful quiet. Yet not everyone accepted the truth with humility. Envy began to grow like weeds in the hearts of some. "Why should one man own so much land?" they grumbled. "He hid it all these years. Maybe he doesn't deserve it." Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into small plots of resentment. The lawyer, seeing the tension, returned to visit Abdul Rahman. "You must protect yourself now," he advised. "People are not always kind when truth strips away their illusions. Some will try to take what is yours." But Abdul Rahman only smiled faintly. "If Allah gave it, Allah will protect it. My duty is to live with dignity, not fear." Meanwhile, the district authorities launched an inquiry into the police officers who had arrested and beaten him. Summons were sent, hearings scheduled. The officers trembled as they faced questions, their once firm voices reduced to stammers. Villagers who had witnessed the arrest were called to testify. Many avoided the hearings, ashamed to admit their role in fueling the false accusations. But some came forward, recounting the sight of Abdul Rahman dragged in chains, his children crying behind him. The more the truth surfaced, the more the village's conscience burned. A group of elders finally visited Abdul Rahman's home. They removed their shoes at his threshold, their heads bowed. "Forgive us," one elder said, his voice breaking. "We judged you wrongly. We mocked you. We abandoned you when you needed us. We forgot that dignity does not come from wealth, but from character." Abdul Rahman listened quietly. He did not gloat, did not remind them of their cruelty. Instead, he served them tea with his own hands, as though nothing had changed. "The past is gone," he said softly. "What matters is how we live today. If you truly wish to change, then treat others with respect. Not just me, but every poor man you see." His words struck deeper than any revelation. For in his humility lay a mirror, one that forced the villagers to confront the ugliness of their own hearts. Still, the shockwaves continued. Newspapers from the nearby city picked up the story. Farmer arrested as thief turns out to own entire village. Journalists arrived, eager to interview the man who had lived as poor while owning riches. Cameras flashed, reporters shoved microphones at him, but Abdul Rahman remained the same, soft-spoken, humble, his answers simple. "I'm just a farmer," he told them. "Land does not make a man greater. Character does." The world watched, but Abdul Rahman never stepped out of his quiet rhythm. Yet inside the village, a transformation had begun. Slow, uneven, but undeniable. Children who once mocked others for patched clothes now thought twice. Shopkeepers hesitated before cheating poor customers. And in the silence of the night, many villagers lay awake, haunted by the memory of their cruelty toward a man who had carried wealth without arrogance. The escalation had shaken not just the village, but the very notion of worth itself. And as tension simmered, one question loomed large over every heart. What would Abdul Rahman do now, with his truth no longer hidden? The story of Abdul Rahman was never just about land. It was never about titles, papers, or wealth hidden in wooden trunks. It was about something far more powerful, how society measures a man. For years, the villagers looked at Abdul Rahman's clothes and saw poverty. They looked at his silence and saw weakness. They looked at his bowed head and assumed shame. And in their blindness, they forgot the truth, that dignity does not wear fine clothes, it does not shout, and it does not need validation from others. Dignity lives quietly, even in the most humble of men. When Abdul Rahman was dragged in chains, the villagers saw only what they wanted to see, a poor man caught as a thief. But when the truth emerged, when the papers proved him to be the landowner of their entire village, they were forced to confront their prejudice. Their shame was not in discovering his wealth, but in realizing that they had scorned a man whose character was richer than all of them combined. And yet, the most powerful moment was not the revelation in court. It was not the gasps or the judge's gavel. The most powerful moment came after, when Abdul Rahman chose forgiveness over revenge. When he told the villagers he would not evict them, not charge them, not seek repayment for their insults. In that moment, he showed them, and us, that true strength lies not in power, but in mercy. Think about it. How often do we judge others by appearances? How often do we laugh at someone for their worn-out clothes, their broken shoes, their small homes? How often do we assume that wealth equals worth, while overlooking the quiet dignity of those who endure hardship with patience? Abdul Rahman's story is not just his own. It is a mirror held up to all of us. A mirror that asks, when we see someone who looks poor, do we see less? When we hear silence, do we assume weakness? When we meet humility, do we mistake it for shame? The villagers learned their lesson the hard way. They had mocked the man who owned the soil beneath their very feet. But the lesson is not theirs alone. It is ours. So let this story remind us. Never measure a person by what they wear, or what they own, or how loudly they speak. Measure them by their patience, by their kindness, by their dignity in the face of cruelty. Because wealth fades, power shifts, but character is eternal. And to those listening, ask yourself, in your own life, Have you dismissed someone because they seem poor or weak or unimportant? Have you judged before knowing the full story? If so, let Abdul Rahman's journey change you. Because the truth is simple. You never know whose land you're standing on.